Imagine a time when the British Empire owed money, not to kings, not to nobles, but to an Indian businessman. A man who, according to their own records, was the richest merchant in the world. His name was Virji Vora, and in the mid-1600s, his word could move silver across oceans and shape the fortunes of empires. This is the untold story of the Indian merchant who became the banker of the British East India Company, and how his rise, power, and fall reveal the forgotten wealth of pre-colonial India. Stay with me because I'm about to reveal why Virji Vora was the richest merchant in 1600s. It's the early 17th century. The Mughal Empire is at its zenith, the most powerful state on the planet. While Europe is still recovering from religious wars, India is booming. Its textiles, spices, and diamonds coveted across the world. And at the heart of this global commerce stands one city, Surat. Surat was no ordinary port. It was a buzzing trade hub on the Arabian Sea, where ships from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and Europe docked side by side. Traders spoke in Gujarati, Arabic, Farsi, and Portuguese. The air was thick with the smell of pepper, nutmeg, indigo, and salt. Caravans from Agra and Lahore arrived loaded with cottons and silks. And in the crowded markets, fortunes were made and lost every day. Among those traders, one name stood out, Virji Vora. His agents could be found in every major port. His warehouses filled entire streets, and according to the English, his wealth was so vast that if all the coins in Surat were gathered together, most would bear his mark. Virji was a banya, part of India's merchant banker caste, whose expertise lay in trade, credit, and accounting. By the time the English East India Company arrived in Surat around 1612, he was already established. Early company records mention him by name, a sign that his influence was already recognized by Europe's new commercial powers. He wasn't a conqueror nor a prince. He was something far more powerful, a financier who understood how money moved. Where others traded goods, Virji traded control. He dealt in everything: spices, silk, pearls, ivory, metals, opium, coral. He was known for cornering entire markets. English records from 1643 call him the sole monopolist of all European commodities. If the Dutch brought cloves or nutmeg to Surat, Virji bought them all. When the English imported lead or quicksilver, he bought their entire cargo, stored it, and released it back to the market at a higher price. In one recorded deal, he bought cloves from the Dutch at 45 rupees per mond and resold them for 65. Multiply that across dozens of commodities, and you begin to see why the English envied him. He wasn't just rich, he was indispensable. And he played the game brilliantly. He extended credit to traders, both Indian and foreign, at interest rates between 1 and 1.5% per month. Rates high enough to profit, but low enough to keep borrowers coming back. Over time, both the Dutch and the English found themselves financially dependent on him. By the mid-1600s, the British East India Company's Surat factory, its trading post, was facing constant financial crises. Their trade relied on huge cash reserves to buy goods in bulk, but India's money markets were tight, so they turned to local financiers. And standing above them all was Virji Vora. The English complained that he keeps the key of all the money in Surat. At one point, they owed him over 6 million rupees, a staggering sum, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. His loans kept their operations afloat. Imagine the irony. The very company that would later become the backbone of the British Empire in India, the same company that toppled princes and ruled millions, once survived on the credit of a Gujarati merchant. He didn't just lend them money, he dictated terms. If they failed to pay interest on time, he could delay their shipments, block the unloading of cargo, or freeze their access to silver. Even the Dutch VOC and the French East India Company relied on his goodwill. Virji's financial web was sophisticated. He used hundis, India's indigenous bills of exchange, to move money across cities and ports without ever touching coin. Through an informal network of agents and money changers, he could transfer funds between Surat, Agra, Masulipatam, and even ports in the Persian Gulf. This system was centuries ahead of its European counterparts in efficiency. He was not just a trader. He was a banker, investor, and central lender rolled into one. He could finance entire fleets and absorb the losses of storms, piracy, or political upheaval. The East India Company might have had ships and soldiers, but in the 1600s, in the Mughal world, cash was king, and Virji Vora was its monarch, the power behind the throne. The Mughal governors of Surat knew this too. Though officially under imperial control, the city's economy ran on private capital. Mughal officials taxed trade, but they needed financiers to move money and provision armies. Virji was often called upon to supply silver or advance payments for the imperial mint. He maintained relationships with Mughal officers, Hindu brokers, and even rival merchants. His influence was so great that when disputes arose between European companies, Mughal officials sometimes consulted him as an intermediary. To the English, he was a rival and a savior rolled into one. They accused him of manipulating prices, yet when they needed credit, they came back to him, hats in hand. His control was so tight that they could not operate without his favor. But like any powerful financier, his empire was built on delicate trust, the kind that could be destroyed overnight. The secrets of his wealth. So how exactly did Virji Vora accumulate such immense fortune? The answer lies in diversification and information. He never relied on a single trade. His agents gathered intelligence on incoming ships, cargo manifests, and market prices. He paid informants to alert him days before a vessel docked so he could decide what to buy or withhold. Knowledge was his weapon, and timing was everything. He also understood monopoly power long before the concept was formally defined. He would buy up entire stocks of goods, pepper, nutmeg, lead, coral, then hold them until scarcity drove prices up. The Europeans grumbled, but they had no choice. If they wanted to sell in India, they had to deal with him. At the same time, he reinvested his profits into lending. Merchants and nobles alike borrowed from him. Even the Mughal governors reportedly took loans from his firm. His warehouses became vaults of silver and gold, and his influence stretched far beyond the docks of Surat. In many ways, he functioned like an early modern investment bank, trading commodities, providing liquidity, managing risk, and financing ventures. Only difference? He did it all without formal institutions or legal contracts, relying purely on reputation and the honor system of the bazaar. But power attracts envy and danger. By the 1660s, the political landscape of Western India was changing. The Mughal Empire was facing rebellion in the Deccan. A new power, the Marathas under Shivaji, was rising fast. And Surat, the jewel of Mughal commerce, became an irresistible target. In January 1664, Shivaji's forces raided Surat. They bypassed the Mughal garrison and went straight for the city's wealthiest merchants. Fires broke out, warehouses burned, and terrified traders fled. Among Shivaji's prime targets was Virji Vora. Dutch and English witnesses recorded that his house and warehouses were looted. Shivaji's men took away gold, silver, pearls, gems, anything of value. One Dutch account claims he lost 6 barrels of treasure. Another report estimated his losses at £50,000 sterling, an enormous fortune. Yet, even after that devastating blow, Virji did not collapse. English letters mention that he still holds up his head and continues trading. His credit network, spread across multiple cities, kept him afloat. But the raid marked the turning point. His liquidity shrank, and his control over the market weakened. As the Mughals and Marathas fought for dominance, Surat's status as India's main port began to decline. Bombay, newly acquired by the British, started to rise. The fall of Virji Vora. In the years after Shivaji's raid, Virji's business gradually receded. He was old, and the turbulent politics made large-scale trade riskier. The English, now shifting focus to Bombay, no longer depended entirely on his credit. By the time of his death, sometime between 1670 and 1675, the world had changed. The Mughal Empire was entering decline. European companies were consolidating control, backed by their governments and militaries. Indigenous merchants, once the masters of capital, were now becoming intermediaries in a system increasingly ruled by foreign power. The fall of Virji Vora was not merely the end of a businessman. It symbolized the fading of a world where Indian merchants financed global trade, where credit flowed from Surat to London, not the other way around. After his death, his business continued for a while under his successors, but none could match his genius. Without his leadership, his networks fragmented, and European capital filled the vacuum. By the early 18th century, the financial landscape of India had changed forever. A legacy erased today, few outside specialist circles even know his name. There are no statues, no portraits, no textbooks telling his story. Yet in his lifetime, he was more powerful than most rulers. The English wrote about him with awe, frustration, and sometimes fear. And this erasure tells its own story. The colonial narrative rewrote economic history, portraying India as a land of poverty and superstition, rescued by European modernity. But Virji Vora's career exposes that myth. India was not a passive participant in global trade, it was one of its architects. Before the British Raj, before colonial capitalism, Indian merchants had already built financial systems that rivaled Europe's. Hundis worked like modern checks. Merchant networks spanned thousands of miles. Ports like Surat, Masulipatam, and Hooghly were bustling cosmopolitan centers long before London or Amsterdam dominated the seas. Virji's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The East India Company did not enter a vacuum. It entered an economy already thriving, and it conquered not through superiority, but through slow financial strangulation. Parallels and contrasts. Historians often compare Virji Vora with later financiers like Jagat Seth in Bengal, another Indian banker who controlled immense wealth in the 18th century. Both men were kingmakers in their time. Both financed governments and foreign companies. And both fell victim to the same pattern: political instability and colonial greed. The difference is that by Jagat Seth's time, British power was backed by muskets and armies. In Virji's age, it was still dependent on Indian credit. His dominance shows that there was a moment in history when the flow of money, influence, and initiative ran from east to west. This shift, and from Virji's world to colonial rule, marks one of the greatest reversals in global economic history. Why his story matters today. Why should we care about a 17th century merchant from Surat? Because his story changes how we see the world. It challenges the assumption that modern capitalism was purely a Western invention. It reminds us that the roots of globalization stretch deep into Asia, long before the Industrial Revolution. Virji Vora represents the forgotten power of Indian enterprise, the ability to dominate global markets through trade, finance, and information. He embodies a period when wealth in India wasn't measured in British pounds, but in the strength of trust, credit, and connections. His downfall also teaches a timeless lesson: economic power without political protection is fragile. He could command money, but not armies. And when the tides of empire shifted, all his silver and spices couldn't save him. Yet, for nearly half a century, Virji Vora proved that an Indian merchant could stand toe-to-toe with the mightiest corporations of Europe and win. What if he had survived the raid? What if he had relocated to Bombay and adapted to the New World Order? Could an Indian trading house have rivaled the East India Company? Could the flow of empire have been reversed? We'll never know. But what we do know is that for a brief, glittering moment, the richest merchant in the world was not a European banker, not a Dutch aristocrat, not an English lord, but an Indian from Surat. Virji Vora's name may have faded from history books, but his legacy whispers from the yellowed ledgers of the East India Company, proof that power, in any age, belongs to those who control credit. So, next time you hear about the East India Company, remember this: before it ruled India, it borrowed from India. Before it became an empire, it was a client. Virji Vora's story isn't just the biography of a forgotten merchant. It's a reminder that history, as we know it, is often written by those who ended up on top, not those who lent them the money to get there. If this story changed how you see Indian and global history, hit the like button, subscribe for more untold chapters from the Mughal and colonial eras, and tell me in the comments, do you think India could have remained a global financial power if merchants like Virji Vora had joined forces? Because sometimes, the line between empire and enterprise is thinner than you think.